Hi, this is Dr. Fry, and this is going to be a lecture on ATP. So, first, I'm just going to review sort of what we have done so far. So, in chemistry of life, we really talked about water and the properties of water and how, particularly, water is polar, which gives it certain properties. It makes it a good solvent, and so it can't move through the plasma membrane because it's polar and things like that. And we also talked about the four macromolecules, which were lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. And those were the four sort of groups of molecules of life, or macromolecules, or biological molecules. You could call them any of that. And then chapter 3 is what we just went over, and what we're going to have a test. We just had a test on. So that was on like cell theory. What is a cell? Why cells are small? And we compared prokaryote and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotes evolved first, and then eukaryotes evolved later. And then we talked about eukaryotic cells. We talked about all the organelles, the endomembrane system, endosymbiosis, where the chloroplasts and the mitochondria were once prokaryotic cells and became part of a eukaryotic cell. We talked about cell membranes and how they're phospholipid bilayers, how they're the fluid mosaic model, and how things move through there. So they can move through with passive transport, where things move with or down the gradient. They do not require energy, but they actually require gradient. And then active transport generally moves against the gradient, and those are usually pumps. They require energy. And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times that form of energy they use is actually ATP. So this chapter is cell structure, and is how cells how cells obtain energy, and we're basically going to talk about the mitochondria here. And mitochondria basically takes ADP and it puts that inorganic phosphate on to make ATP. So ADP and ATP, they're sort of like a hammer. They're a tool that doesn't really get used up. Okay. So you, at the end of this, you will be able to draw and label the structure of ATP and describe ATP hydrolysis. So I'm going to go over that. We will going to talk about this phosphorylation there. Phosphorylation. Okay, so I am probably going to give you a video here to watch that sort of goes with this part of the lecture. So all organisms require energy to carry out their essential life processes such as growth, reproduction, and movement. So plants can make their own energy because they have chlorophyll and they can make sugar, but we have to eat our energy. And the main way we eat okay, so these are autotrophs. Autotrophs are plants. They can do photosynthesis, therefore they can make sugar, which is their own form of energy. And then they can take that sugar and make carbohydrates, and eventually it's all carbon based, so they can make their fats, they can make everything they need, they can make all their amino acids. So anyways, heterotrophs are organisms like us that cannot make their own energy, so we have to eat our energy. Okay, so the sun is the ultimate source, and photosynthesis does require light. And But if you have chloroplasts, and not necessarily even chloroplasts, just chlorophyll, um, plants, cyanobacteria, which are blue-green algae, cyanobacteria are blue-green algae, and green algae, they can do this. So that's actually not about right there. All right. So so um, So, since energy cannot be created or destroyed, it must be converted from light energy into another, more useful form for heterotrophs. And this is food. And basically, we get our energy from carbohydrates and fats. And carbohydrates are more short term energy, and fats are more long term energy. And fats is a more efficient way to store energy because it has those long carbon and hydrogen bonds. So there's a lot more energy in a gram of fat than there is in a gram of carbs. So the benefit of carbs, it can easily be fed into the mitochondria. Where if you're burning fat, there has to be some processing done before it can actually get fed into the mitochondria to make ATP. Okay, so burning releases a large amount of energy rapidly, and if that happened to us, our cells would burn up. So we need a small amount of, we need a lot of energy, but we need it in constant small amounts. And so it's done by a good many steps, which is what we're going to go over here. Basically, there's four, depending on who you talk to, 3 or 4 steps in cellular respiration. And that is going to produce ATP. Okay, ATP is actually a nucleotide, adenosine. So this is, I don't know how you get rid of that thing. All right, can I move it? How do I get rid of that? I don't know how to get rid of that. All right, so you can't really see that. I think it's actually in the next slide. All right, this is it right here. So this is actually adenosine, which is one of the 4 nucleotides, and it's found in DNA and RNA. So adenosine is, and it's tri, which means 3, and phosphate. So it has 3 phosphates. So this would be the backbone in the nucleotide, and then this would link up with another nitrogen. This is a nitrogenous base. So this would link up with another one to, if it was RNA, it would be single-stranded. But if it was double-stranded, it would be hooked up right here to another nitrogenous base to a nucleotide over here. But this bond here actually is a high energy bond, and there's charges on here, right? So these are all negative charges. So phosphate is charged. And to be honest, there's energy here too, but we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to talk about this. So this is the bond that's going to break, but these are all covalent bonds, right? All of this is covalent bonds, but these are charged. So they do have a negative charge to them. But triphosphate, right? That means 3 phosphates. Okay. So hydrolysis is the idea that it's going to lose that terminal phosphate group. Okay, so when that occurs, it becomes ADP, and D means di, right? T means tri, D means di. So now it's going to lose that, right? And now this is adenosine diphosphate because it has 2 of them, all right? And but it gives off this inorganic phosphate. And this inorganic phosphate really is going to act like something that turns things on. So if you have to start making something, it needs ATP, that this phosphate here will attach to it, and it's going to turn it on. So when you have that phosphate attached to it, it turns on. And when the phosphate comes off, it turns off. And when it comes off, this ADP and this inorganic phosphate is going to have to go back to the mitochondria to get to made back into ATP, and I'll show you that. We'll do stuff with that. All right. So it is like a rechargeable battery, and so this is a charged battery, and then with this comes off, you're going to release some energy, and a lot of times this inorganic phosphate here is what turns things on. So I think that's what I'm going to say about that. Okay, so then when it goes, and then when this comes off, it's going to have to be transformed back into ATP in the mitochondria. So the mitochondria takes ADP plus an inorganic phosphate and it makes ATP. That's what the mitochondria does, but it does it in several steps. Okay. So ATP molecules diffuse throughout the cell, supplying energy to many of the cell's processes. An active cell needs millions of ATP molecules a second. So right now you are burning ATP. So ATP can transfer energy by adding a phosphate group to many molecules. This reaction is called phosphorylation. And I want to show you an example of this here. And you could do this when we do cell communication. I'm not really sure if we're going to do that actually. But this is a receptor protein, right? And this would be a ligand or a signal molecule that's going to say, okay, we need something turned on here. And it's going to activate this molecule. So this is going to activate this kinase, right? So it's going to activate it. It's going to turn it on. And in that case, it's going to turn this on. But it's going to require ATP. And that ATP then, so you see that phosphate group came off of that. So now it's ADP, right? This phosphate came off of here and it hooked onto that. And now it's going to turn this one on. The phosphate group came off of that and hooked onto that. And now it's going to turn this on. And now it's going to need ATP here, right? So this phosphate came off of here and hooked onto that. So it turned that on. And eventually it could be a cellular response. So this all happens in lots of different steps, and this is called a phosphorylation cascade. But I just want to sort of, here is how ATP kind of works. So this phosphate, this inorganic phosphate here, turns things on. And then when it comes off, it's actually going to go back. It's going to deactivate it, right? And that phosphate's going to come off. And then ADP and PI have to go back to the mitochondria, and that phosphate has to get put back on there to make ATP. So that's basically ATP gets cycled. Okay, so that's what I sort of wanted you to understand there. So ATP is involved in many processes. Active transport requires ATP because it moves things generally against the concentration gradient, right? So it's moving yellow this way. So that's against the concentration gradient. It's moving low to high. And it's moving the red this way, and that's also moving from low to high. This is that sodium-potassium pump. So it's also needed for DNA replication. And even though the mitochondria makes ATP, it does require some ATP. And the same with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis makes a little bit of ATP, but it requires more ATP than it actually makes. So anyway, this is what we're going to do now. This is the mitochondria. This is what we're going to talk about next. So we're really going to talk about how that mitochondria takes that ADP plus PI to make ATP. That's the end result. But there's many steps in between that, because things happen sort of in steps. All right, so I think that's it. So that's it for this one. And I'll hope that's helpful.